Florida is booming, or so the headlines like to spin. The beaches are packed, airports are bursting, and the state just set another record for tourists. On its surface, the Sunshine State appears invincible. But here's the surprise. Beneath the shiny statistics, an essential thread of Florida's tourism is slowly unraveling: Canada. For years, Canadians have not been mere weekend tourists. They've been the economic backbone of Florida in winter. They stock hotels when Americans return home, lease condos by the month, purchase property, dine out every day, golf, and sustain small businesses during the slow season. But now, the statistics are saying a far different tale. Tens of thousands of Canadians are no longer arriving. Travel agents are reporting wholesale cancellations, border traffic is down drastically, and some Canadian firms are even instigating open boycotts of U.S. destinations. The question is, why? Why would one of America's closest and friendliest neighbors suddenly abandon Florida after a century of devotion? The reality goes deeper than beaches and sunshine. This is not simply about tourism. It's politics, trade war, national pride, and a series of diplomatic rebuffs that cut close to the bone. And as Florida touts record-breaking tourism in general, those communities that depend most on Canadian visitors are already beginning to pay the price. In this video, we're going to dissect exactly what's going on, how it all began, who ignited it, and why the ripple effects may end up costing Florida billions. Before we get into it, take a second to click that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and turn on notifications. By the time we're finished with this breakdown, I promise, you'll be looking at Florida's tourism economy in a whole new light. Now let's see the figures. On paper, Florida is invincible. Just in the second quarter of 2025 alone, the state received over 34 million visitors, the highest in that quarter to date. Hotels were filled to capacity, airports clogged, and politicians were not shy about proclaiming Florida's tourism brand was healthier than ever. But under that top-line figure is a dire warning sign. Canada, one of Florida's most reliable tour pipes, is contracting. During the same record-breaking quarter, Canadian visitors fell from approximately 739,000 the previous year to only 640,000. That represents close to 100,000 fewer visitors in only 3 months. And it's not just a dip. Canadians used to account for more than 3% of all tourists in Florida. Now, they've dropped below 2%. That may look minor at first glance, but here's the thing. Canadian travelers aren't like Georgia weekenders or Ohioans. They don't visit for an extended weekend stay. They visit for weeks, sometimes months, and that sustained effect really opens up Florida's economy. Canadians aren't tourists. They're part-time residents. They lease condos for months, do their shopping at local stores, purchase real estate, and keep restaurants, golf courses, and even doctors' offices in business all winter long. On paper, Florida still appears to be shattering tourism records, but if you examine it carefully, the fissures are already showing. The decline in Canadian visitors isn't a temporary slump, it's an upward trend. And if it keeps going, the same communities that rely on snowbirds to get them through the winter may be the first to suffer economically from the frost. To get an idea why this slowdown is important, you need to appreciate how integral Canadians are to the Florida economy. Yes, Americans from across the nation drive enormous numbers, but Canadian tourists have a completely different function. They're not coming in for a Disney long weekend or a Miami Beach quick getaway. Most of them are second homeowners, families, or retirees, the snowbirds, who flee Canada's harsh winters by settling in Florida for several weeks or even months. And that implies they're not merely reserving a restaurant or hotel room once or twice. They're renting condos for whole seasons, loading grocery carts full every week, playing golf for hours, and even scheduling visits to local medical doctors and dentists. They essentially behave less as tourists and more as temporary residents. And that consumer spending does accumulate, particularly during Florida's slower months when domestic tourism dribbles in at a trickle. Economists caution that even a 10% decline in Canadian tourists would wipe out more than $2 billion in spending nationwide and eliminate more than 14,000 jobs. Zoom in on Florida, and Canadians represent one of the state's largest international visitor segments, and the effect is even greater. For local businesses in coastal towns and retirement communities, Canadians are the difference between survival and shutdown. When they cancel trips, it's not just empty beach chairs we're talking about. It's condos that go unrented, golf courses sitting half empty, real estate deals put on hold, and restaurant owners wondering how they'll make payroll. That's why a shrinking Canadian presence isn't just another tourism statistic. It's a flashing red warning light for Florida's economy. By early 2025, anger in Canada had boiled over, and what began as sporadic complaining turned into a complete boycott of the United States. Initially, it was here and there on social media that someone would vow they'd spend their winter holidays in Mexico or the Caribbean instead. But it wasn't just that. Next thing anyone knew, big newspapers and television networks in Canada were reporting on it. Websites and applications rolled out to prevent Canadians from using U.S. products. Twitter hashtags asking Canadians to boycott travel went viral across the country. And the numbers show just how fast that flame caught on. During February and March, Canadian bookings for flights to the United States plummeted, falling by over 70% from the previous year. Even family road vacations to the south for the winter, a decades-old tradition, declined by almost a quarter. In certain border communities, local business owners said Canadian traffic was off as much as 80%. Florida, not unexpectedly, was one of the worst affected. One Quebec travel agent, who used to sell a lot of Floridas, confessed that her bookings decreased by 60% overnight. In Fort Lauderdale, Canadian owners started selling their condos, but now no longer were there Canadians available to take their place. One hotelier even remembered one guest who stood his ground and walked away from a $1,000 deposit, opting instead to winter in Cuba. This was no longer about politics. For a lot of Canadians, it was now about pride. Spending dollars in Florida no longer felt like a holiday. It felt like condoning a nation that, in their view, was ignoring and disrespecting them. The boycott had become personal. How did things get so out of hand then? The movement hadn't been created overnight. It was driven by two strong forces: money and words. On the financial side, the United States rekindled a trade war in early 2025 by imposing severe tariffs, additional taxes, on Canadian products, even up to 25% in certain cases. Canada retaliated with tariffs. Overnight, two countries long regarded as the closest of friends were behaving like competitors. And while tariffs may sound like dry, abstract policy, Canadians felt the pinch directly. Higher prices at home and headlines presented as an attack on their economy. Words came next, and in many ways, they cut even deeper. Public comments implying Canada should be treated as America's 51st state spread like wildfire through Canadian media. To a nation that proudly boasts of its independence and identity, those words were not just dismissive, but insulting. And add to that the scar of old wounds, such as the infamous G7 feud in 2018, when Canada's Prime Minister was publicly labeled dishonest and weak, and resentment had been building for years. By 2025, the mixture of trade wars and rhetoric finally ignited the fuse. What might have still been a matter of policy debate suddenly turned personal for Canadians on a scale of millions. And for many, the easiest way to resist wasn't political. It was to cancel their Florida trip. But money and politics aren't the only things keeping Canadians at bay. There's also a creeping suspicion that traveling through the U.S. border just isn't as simple or as secure as it used to be. In recent years, increasingly, Canadian tourists have been reported to be flagged for additional scrutiny at the border. Some were subjected to lengthy hostile interrogation. Others had phones or laptops inspected by border officials. Tales of tourists being held or bullied into opening personal devices hit national headlines, raising concerns about privacy. Then suppose a Canadian family is making plans for what should be a leisurely winter vacation. Those anecdotes cast a shadow of uncertainty. No one wants to begin their holiday by being questioned, or by not knowing if their personal information will be duplicated. The American government presents these policies as required measures of security. But to Canadians, they seem less like protection and more like an unwelcome greeting. The tension was further heightened with travel advisories piling on additional pressure. In 2023, Canada issued a warning to their LGBTQ+ citizens, calling for caution when traveling in areas of the United States where new legislation may place them in danger. Florida was not specifically named, but the advisory put many Canadian families on edge. Combined, these problems have achieved something bigger than economics: an atmosphere of mistrust. The question is no longer simply, can we afford to go? But also, are we going to be welcome and treated with dignity if we do? That doubt in itself is sufficient to drive more Canadians to other destinations like Mexico, Cuba, and the Caribbean. On the surface, Florida still appears to be booming. Domestic tourists keep flowing in from all over the United States, and foreign tourists from nations such as Brazil are keeping the numbers afloat. That's why politicians adore bragging about record-breaking tourism. However, the headline doesn't tell the entire story. The losses are all from Canada, and they bite hard. Imagine Gulf Coast cities featuring winter condominium rows, or small Atlantic coastal cities where Canadian snowbirds have been faithful for generations. These are not weekenders. They're snowbird residents who occupy units for 4 months, sustaining local economies. When they disappear, whole neighborhoods become less vibrant, golf courses go half-occupied, restaurants struggle to pay bills, and real estate markets come to a halt. Indeed, South Florida agents say something previously unimaginable: Canadian sellers now outnumber Canadian buyers. That flip mirrors the extent to which the dynamic has changed. And here's the larger risk: if it continues, the cost won't be quantified in missed vacations. It might be job losses, closed businesses, foreclosed homes, and a weakened economic core along Florida's coasts. Yes, Florida can continue to set records for a little while longer, but the warning lights are flashing bright red. The Canadian withdrawal is not a dip. It's a fissure in the foundation of Florida's winter economy. The actual question now is whether or not leaders will step in to fix this relationship, or if politics and pride will continue to drive away one of Florida's most loyal customer bases. Florida isn't falling apart just yet, but the cracks are appearing, and Canadians are sending a message loud and clear. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more in-depth stories, and enable notifications so you never miss the next one.